part 2 of the concrete casting exercise. It's now a couple of days since the rubber was poured, and the first thing I'm going to be doing is unpacking this and seeing what's happened underneath all of this. One thing I have found out since recording part 1 is that the rubber that I used on the previous 2 moulds, the one I was talking about before, this really quite firm hammerable rubber, is a different rubber to what I've used on this occasion. The old one is a 75/60 rated rubber. That's produces a rubber on the A60 of the hardness scale. That's the order of a sort of soft tyre. The new rubber is 74/29, and that comes out at an A30, or my guess is possibly A29 given the numbers of the hardness scale, and that's on the sort of medium soft sort of scale. So it's going to be interesting to see how well this softer rubber works. Both are recommended for concrete. The original one was described as firm, and this one is just described as suitable for concrete. So we'll have to see how that works out. Okay, so I've got the master out of the rubber. I didn't show you that because it took quite a long time, it wasn't very pretty, and was a completely destructive process from the point of view of the master. There were several points where I was a little concerned that it was going to work at all. However, the mould is now out. It's a lot more flexible than any of the predecessors, so that ties in with what we expected. But it is looking pretty good, and so I think it's time we put some concrete in it. Okay, on to the final step now. I've mixed up a small quantity of concrete. I'm using a 3-to-1 mortar mix, so just sharp sand and cement. Nothing special, just ordinary builder supply stuff. Before we put the concrete in here though, obviously I've clamped up the outer frame, so that'll hold this rather floppy rubber steady, and I'm going to give the inside of the mould a coat of concrete mould release agent. And hopefully this will be more successful than the release agent I used on the master. This has generally been pretty good. Talk amongst yourselves a moment. After I put the release agent in, I tend to just tip the mould up on one end just to avoid there being any concentrations of the release agent in that would result in some form of sort of dent in the concrete. Also means that any nooks and crannies that it hasn't got to yet, it'll have a chance to run into. Okay, let's go for it. Okay, let's put some concrete in here. Using this tool, it's just a gardening tool, just to eventually shake the concrete into the corners. The concrete's one of these weird things that if you vibrate it, it flows better. And this is one of the cases we do ideally want to get the air bubbles out of the system. Not going to be critical because the appearance doesn't need to be a smooth appearance, because bricks are, or these blocks are naturally have a texture to them, so the odd air bubble really doesn't make any odds. Right, okay, so the mould is now basically full. You'll notice with the concrete, the water tends to rise to the top. We still want to make sure that we've got the air bubbles out of this. So if this is a professional job, there would be a sort of a big vibrating table thing we could put it on, and that would shake it, and then all the bubbles would just rise to the top. As this is not a professional job, I have a fudge. Happen to have an old sander that I don't use very much for sanding, because it's but it does vibrate quite well. That's about as far as we can go at this stage. The concrete I'll usually leave to set for a couple of days. It'll be interesting over time to see whether with this new softer rubber that the may be able to shorten that time, because one of the reasons for allowing it 2 days to go off was because of the more rigid rubber that on the other molds, you needed a certain amount of strength in the concrete before you start trying to take it out of the mould. With this new softer rubber, I think the jury's out until we've extracted a couple of moulds, but I'll just keep it a couple of days for the moment, especially given the length of this one. It's a couple of days since we poured the concrete now, and here we have the final product. It's for a first cast out of a mould. It's fairly good. There's more air bubbles than ideal in the top surface. That's probably because I was paying more attention to the videoing process than I was to the concreting process when I was packing the mould. I'm very pleased with the way that the concrete released from the mould. The mould really just simply fell away. That was quite reassuring. There's a fair bit of moisture still in the concrete at this stage, so this is a perfect time if there's any flashing or any fiddling you want to do with the surface, then either by hand or something like an old screwdriver, you can do small tweaks on the surface while it's still a little bit soft, and then really I should just leave it for a couple of days to probably harden up and strengthen up before I put it onto the railway. So all that remains now is to say thank you very much for watching. I very much enjoyed sharing the process with you, and I hope to see you again sometime. Cheers. Hi, it's me again. I just thought as I was wrapping up the second video that I would tack on the end a few notes and reflections over the process, especially having now cast a second section of walling out of this new mould. The second one, the concrete mix was a bit wetter, in fact a little over wet in this case, and it's much smoother. I could take a little bit longer over things like the vibration process as well, because I wasn't doing the videoing. There's still one or two tiny little air bubbles on the surface, so it's not perfect, but then for something like a wall that's not an issue. And in fact, actually, personally, I think I prefer the original cast, which had a slightly rougher texture on the wall facing. Obviously for other types of model then you wouldn't want that, but for wall, which all of these are walls, then it's really not a big issue. One omission that I forgot to mention in the first video, and it's fairly self-evident, at least it will be as soon as you try it, and that is that when you're pouring the rubber, it may look a bit thick and gloopy, but it will level out. Make sure that the mould, the casing around it is level. so you can definitely get the spirit levels out and get that level and firm, because it will leak if it gets half a chance to do so. So reflections on the two rubber types, the 7560 that I started with and the 7429 that I used on this occasion. The getting the concrete out of this new softer rubber is a complete doddle, particularly for something like this, which is essentially a cuboid. Once you've got the end off, the whole thing just falls away, and there's absolutely no issues at all with demoulding. At the point where I poured this one, I also poured one of the block walling sections, and treated them identically. It's the same mix, same treatment, same level of demoulding agent on it, and it was so much easier to get out the soft rubber than even this well established firmer one. I mean, that came out fine, but it was just easier with this one. I wonder a little bit about the longevity of the softer rubber. I'm not sure there's any rationale behind that, but it just seems that this really is extremely tough. This one, I mean, yes, it's tough, but I obviously haven't used it for two casts, so it's difficult to tell at this stage. On the subject of masters, the downside with this one was most definitely the wrestling match that I had with it and the master. The master is really in very small pieces now. Now, you only do that once per mould. The risk is, of course, that you damage the rubber in the process of getting the master out. So now I've done this 3 times now, and it's been a struggle every time. And in the past, on the whole, I've generally been fairly generous with mould release agents on the master, and it really hasn't made, as far as I can tell, any obvious difference. So I think my approach in the future is going to be to assume that the master is going to end up in pieces at the end of the day, and therefore just make it in a form that it was going to be easier to get out of the rubber than otherwise. So my next models are likely to be either something like a platform section or a low profile building to go on the against a wall on the railway. Those are going to be essentially the same as these, different shape obviously, what have you, but they are going to be shallow, large area, and flat and with straight sides. If you were doing a deeper model, something like a shed or a small building or something along those lines, then definitely I would go for the softer rubber. Hesitation there because at some point you get to the point where it's going to be easy to do a 2-part mould, and in which case you're going to want the stiffer rubber, because I can't see a 2-part mould working with this softer stuff. If you have enough, a thin enough border to the softer rubber, I think you could pretty much turn the whole thing inside out when sort of peeling to get the release the concrete. So I may experiment with that at some point, but it's not on my urgent list. I've got quite a lot of a wall to cast just yet. Okay, so I think that really is everything for me now. Thank you for watching. I hope that maybe one day then we can welcome you to the Dell House, and to you can have a play on the Flatland Wells Railway. Until then, goodbye and thank you. now got this thing. Is it going to focus? No. Great, we're in the middle of COVID-19 lockdown and the skies are devoid of airplanes except for the one that has decided to fly round in circles. That might be. I'll be back shortly.